Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I am very delighted and honored tonight to introduce you Professor Walter Armsbrust in a few words. He is a professor of modern Middle Eastern studies at the University of Oxford and Anthony's College. He is an anthropologist and author of Mass Culture and Modernism in Egypt, as well as numerous articles and book chapters focusing on popular culture, mass media, and politics, mainly in Egypt, with a historical scope reaching back to about the 1930s. His latest publication is dedicated to martyrs and trickers, an ethnography of the Egyptian Revolution, published in 2019 at the Princeton University Press. His today's paper is focused on the current stakes of the digital preservation and the challenges that the digital turn represents to preserve the today's archives and media formats, media supports. In order to preserve the today's archives, especially in the context of Gulf societies. So the floor is yours, Professor Walter Armbrust, for 45 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Jan, for that introduction, and thanks to the organizers of the conference. It's been a fantastic conference. I've really enjoyed all of the papers thus far and have learned a lot. So let me begin by sharing my screen. Let's see if I can, okay, I've got it optimized. Now if I can just find my, there it is. Letting me go to full screen. Okay, there we go. Okay. It's a great honor to be addressing you as a keynote speaker. Societies of the Gulf aren't my specialty, so I will try to talk about issues of relevance to cultural production in a fairly broad sense, but of course, including in the Gulf. My lecture will be informed by my own experience of studying a fairly wide variety of cultural forms in Egypt. Although the general issue in my talk is what digitization implies for historical memory, I'm going to introduce my topic through a recorded snippet of a Ramadan television show, which was broadcast in the United Arab Emirates in 1994, using the internet as my archive for contextualizing this little snippet. The means of preservation of virtually all information are now primarily digital. The television show I have in my possession was broadcast more or less at the midpoint of the historical transition between analog and digital media. I recorded it during a visit to Al-Ain on a VHS tape, which I later digitized. And I'm approaching it in this lecture as if I were a historian without access to human sources. The program was called Musabaqat fi Hayat al-Ams, Contests in the Life of Yesterday. As you can guess from the title, it revolved around contests, but also around riddles. I'm going to begin by playing a bit of it for you. The first clip, I have to warn you, is fairly long. There are a couple of more clips, but they're short, and there will also be some video playing silently in the background, illustrating some of the other things I'm talking about. So here is the first of the
ودنا لو نشوف فقرة رماية. احنا معنا مجموعة من المتسابقين نبغى نشوف سلاحهم ونشوفهم وتتابعونا. الأخ عيد من أبطال الرماية أيضا وأحد الهدافين الجديرين بالاحترام هو الأخ حريز. الأخ منصور خبير في السلاح القديم وعرف في السلاح القديم واخترناه من ضمن اللجنة حتى نتابع. فريق اليوم تفضلوا نشوف من فضلكم إخواني اللجنة. فريق اليوم بينهم هم ثلاثة، بينهم واحد من الخبراء متحدي الشباب. أبغى أتعرف عليهم أولا واحد ورا الثاني. نتعرف على اسم الكريم؟
سعيد بن سالم بن محمد العامري.
مرحبا يا سعيد.
الله يحييك.
الله يحييك يا سعيد. ايش تشتغل يا سعيد؟
والله شغل خاص يعني.
شغل خاص. وهاي سلاحك وش هو؟
هذه ابو خمس.
ايش اسمها؟
صقريه.
صقريه.
نعم.
هذه لك ولا حق الشيوخ؟
هذه حق جدي.
حق جدك؟
نعم.
حي جدك.
لا قلت
الله يغفر له، عساه الجنه.
الله يسلمك.
من كم سنه عمرها هذه؟
والله عمرها تقريبا يعني من فوق ال 78 سنه.
78.
نعم.
الله يطول عمرك.
الله يطول عمرك
ويخلي سلاحك لك. كم عمرك انت؟
انا عمري 28 سنه تقريبا.
وش شعورك والخبره جالسه على يمينك؟
عندنا الوالد هذه الحقيقه
يقول انا متحدي الشباب.
يقول هو متحدي الشباب وعنده ولا عادات وعنده خبره قديمه يعني اكثر منا.
ايه.
ونتمنى له التوفيق ان شاء الله واحنا مع الجميع يعني.
الله يطول عمرك.
الله يطول ان شاء الله.
والاخ نشوف تعرف الاسم؟
الاسم سالم سعيد نايع النيادي.
مرحبا يا سالم.
نعم.
مرحبا يا سالم.
الله يحييك.
سالم كم عمرك من فضلك؟
عمري والله في الحدود 56
ايه
او 55.
وش بلاك متحدي الشباب اليوم؟
اليوم بس اتمنى ان شاء الله اتحداهم
ايه
وافوز عليهم.
هذه بندقيتك وش هي؟ صيعريه بعد؟
هذه صوجريه.
صوجريه.
نعم.
هذه كم عمرها طول عمرك؟
87.
87 سنه.
اي.
الله يطول عمرك ويخليك سلاحك.
نعم.
وتتم سلاحك في يمناك. ابى اشوف الحين همه الخبره ولا همه الشباب؟
ان شاء الله.
من رخصتك.
الله رضوان الله.
والاخ شو الاسم يبا؟
الاسم صالح طويرة سالف المنهالي.
مرحبا يا منهالي. كم عمرك يا صالح؟
والله حدود 37 تقريبا.
37.
نعم.
ما هي بعيدة عن 56 الا 20 سنة.
يعني بين هذيل وبين ذيل.
بين ذيل. لا بس انت تعتبرنا الشباب.
انا ودي مع الشباب غير الشباب.
الحين نشوف. الحين كلنا ذراع من خام يجسي.
هذا الله كريم هذا حظ وتوفيق.
مستعدين؟
ان شاء الله.
كلكم مستعدين؟ استعدوا واخذوا وضع الرماية. نشوف.
تفضل بسم الله.
نشوف الخبرة ولا الشباب؟ الخبرة ولا الشباب؟ عاد إذا أخذها عليكم الخبرة بيكون يستاهل لأنه متعلم على السلاح القديم. خلوا من فضلك. 3 رصاصات. 3 رصاصات مشترك فيها واحد من الخبرة عمره 57 سنة وواحد 23 وواحد 27. ما شاء الله على جلسته بعد يسراوي.
يسراوي.
ايه. 2 معنا يسراويين. بتشوف اللجنة بتشوف.
لا الله على
سلاحكم معمر؟ ايه من فضلكم. نبي نشوف اللجنة قربت، نبي نشوف الخبرة ولا الشباب؟ الخبرة. يستاهل. يستاهل. شو اسمك الكريم قلت؟
سالم سعيد نايع النيادي.
مبروك يا سالم.
الله يبارك.
اخذتها على الشباب.
الله يبارك فيك.
الا بسالك هاي سلاح معك مبطي انت؟
نعم.
من متى؟
والله الحين حوالي يجي من 7 سنوات.
دايم ترمي عليه.
نعم.
بس خبره وعلى وصول. الله يحييك التصفيات بين الشباب.
ان شاء الله.
ترى بنصفي بينك وبين الشباب بعد.
توكل على الله وترك يشارك فيه البركه.
ما الله يبارك في ايامك. مرحبا بك. فرصه سعيده يا شباب وما يعني ارجو لكم حظ احسن في مره ثانيه ان شاء الله. شكرا جزيلا.
So that's the musabakat portion of the show, a good taste of it. One might speculate about how competitive the contest really was, though I've been told it's not uncommon for older marksmen with steady hands to have an advantage over younger shooters. As you can see from the continuation of the program, which is now playing silently, the scene shifts from the shooting range to a stage set up to look like a campfire. It was probably constructed on the outskirts of the oasis town of Al Ain, inland from Abu Dhabi. On the set, the men are in one section sitting on carpets spread in sand, women are in another, and some people are seated on bleachers. This is the riddle portion of the show, in which the presenter asks questions to the audience seated around him. In my recorded portion of the show, the presenter gets the question from a political celebrity, Sheikh Sultan bin Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, who is seated on one side of the stage in a Mercedes with other members of the ruling family. Let me show you the part of the show in which the question is asked.
عين خير معي سؤال ثاني من سمو الشيخ سلطان ب30,000 درهم. عين خير، عندي سؤال: أين يوجد جبل الأبيتر؟ صح شيخ؟ واخر يا مصور، واخر يا سلطان، واخر بشوف الشيخ. صح يا شيخ؟ زين.
The 30,000 dirhams offered by Sheikh Sultan for answering that one question was worth about $8,100 in 1994. The questions in that episode were all about local geography, testing knowledge of place names, which I assume were no longer commonly used, or maybe were just obscure enough to pose a challenge. In this case, where is Jabal al-Abayt? The presenter walks past the men and turns to the women for the answers. Some of the women direct him to a tall woman who has the answer, Sir Ben Iyas, an island off the western coast of Abu Dhabi, which is now the site of a nature reserve. The benign and beneficent presence of the rulers is an important part of the show, and let me show you how it ends.
شكرا ومبروك لك باكرة. تفضلي. يغادر الآن سيداتي وسادتي سمو الشيخ طحنون بن محمد وسمو الشيخ سلطان بن خليفة بن زايد آل نهيان بحفظ الله ورعايته، بعد أن قاموا بدعم هذا البرنامج الذي هو منكم وإليكم. وتلاحظون سيداتي وسادتي أن الدعم المستمر المتواصل من أسرة آل نهيان الكرام ومن التجار ومن المواطنين هو السبب في دعم ونجاح هذا البرنامج. حفظهم الله ومع السلامة. انتهت حلقة الليلة من هذا البرنامج. شكرا لكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
The program functioned as a clinic in nation building through a series of invented traditions predicated on seeing Emirati society as a patriarchal dynastic realm. The foundation of patriarchy is deference to the authority of senior males, and by that logic, the old man's victory in the shooting contest was inevitable. The riddle contest was a nostalgia-laden staging of Bedouinness, as the title of the show suggests, Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams, contests in the life of yesterday. The emphasis is on remembering the Bedouin life of yesterday, precisely at a moment when the experience of the younger generation was diverging sharply from that of their elders. The program elevated Bedouinness into a national symbol, though one can easily also say that the real point is to impose a panoply of national symbols, given that a substantial portion of the citizenry of the United Arab Emirates were urban and more focused on the sea and on trans-regional trade than on the desert. The riddle contest around the campfire stage was directed towards women rather than men. And the riddles themselves, at least in that episode, were an exercise in defining Emirati geography. The appeal of the campfire imagery was primordialist in nationalist terms, but the defining of Emirati territory, precisely measured, named, and made literal by drawing lines in the sand, is an impeccably modern impulse. The presence of Sheikh Sultan and Tahnoon of the Al Nahyan family in a Mercedes ties geography and the memory of a symbolic Bedouin past to the political present. When Benedict Anderson wrote Imagined Communities, he argued that nationalism was fatal to sacred languages and the politics of dynastic realms. That was clearly a Eurocentric argument. One might instead argue that dynastic political systems are no less adept at devising unifying symbols than liberal or authoritarian systems, and certainly not more violent in their impositions of unity onto citizens that were in fact socially diverse. The only slightly ambiguous note to the program's vision of a past in which the current national borders and the attendant symbolic and political systems that defined them were tangible and unarguable realities was the presenter, a veteran television presenter and producer named Fawzi El-Khamis. El-Khamis was Saudi, not Emirati, and most of his broadcast career in the television medium took place in Qatar. though he also worked in both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. My search on the internet for variants of the term Al-A'lami Fawzi al-Khamis, the television personality or presenter Fawzi al-Khamis, turned up mostly short snippets of this one program that I had recorded, though not necessarily from the same episode. A few disparate blog and Twitter posts suggested that it was broadcast throughout the decade, although the year 1994, the year that I recorded my recording, seemed to come up whenever a nostalgic Twitter poster mentioned a specific date. At any rate, I found a few video fragments that were similar to my own. The one on your screen is from a Twitter post from an episode in which the ruler himself, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, visited the set rather than sending one or more of his sons, as he did in the clip that I showed you. Al-Khamis did appear in at least one other Emirati Ramadan program, a quiz show adapted from the American show Jeopardy! This was in 1993, before Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams, and it was called Musabakat Huruf, the contest of letters, and it was broadcast on the Dubai television channel. It appears to have been a knockoff of a Saudi quiz show by the same name, which was broadcast from 1985 to 1998 and hosted by several different presenters, but not, as far as I can tell, by Al-Khamis. In this case, the questions were geared to knowledge of the entire Arab world and not just the United Arab Emirates. And as you can see in visual terms, it juxtaposes a Bedouin-themed background for Al-Khamis, but seats the contestants in front of a background of modern skyscrapers, unlike the more consistent Bedouin theme of the Abu Dhabi-produced Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams. To return to Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams, given that the program was predicated on preserving a heritage implicitly conceived as ephemeral, albeit a heritage formulated as an invented tradition, Al-Khamis was the right man for the job, according to a 45-minute program broadcast on television in 2019. Al-Khamis was Mr. Turath on a pan-Arab scale, focusing not just on the Gulf, but on the whole Arab world. In one place, the credits to Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams describes his role as i'dad wa taqdim, preparation and presentation. In another place, he is described as mushrif al-intaj, production advisor, just before another person who is named as mudir al-intaj, the director of production. Television production is typically divided between a creative side and an executive side. So as far as one can tell from the credits, Fawzi al-Khamis was the primary creative director of the program, and presumably the Mudir al-Intaj was in charge of the executive side. On that basis, I'm provisionally assuming that this program was to a meaningful degree Fawzi al-Khamis's brainchild, but this doesn't mean that he invented the idea of Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams out of thin air. Fawzi al-Khamis may have been Mr. Turath in a folkloric and literary and historical sense, but he doesn't acknowledge the Turath of his medium. Possibly the idea of telling riddles during Ramadan nights is ancient throughout the region. I really can't say for sure, but the mass mediation and national symbolism of Ramadan riddles had a substantial regional history. Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams borrows from the general idea of the quiz show, for which Fawzi al-Khamis had been a presenter in Musabakat Huruf, but the nation-building agenda of Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams was much more ambitious than the Huruf program, which had essentially no visual impact. Al-Khamis surely was also inspired by Egypt. In Egypt, the mediation of Ramadan riddles as a television show, and indeed the evolution of this custom into a mass spectacle, goes back to at least the 1950s. Given Egypt's role in the 20th century as the primary media content provider for the Arabic-speaking world, neither Al-Khamis nor his audiences could possibly have been unaware of this. The person credited with inventing Fawzi Ramadan as a media event is Amil Fahmy, a television journalist who started the custom in Egypt in 1955. She was known for interviewing cultural figures. In keeping with her specialty, the program started off by her doing an interview each night of Ramadan, but not naming the guest. Listeners were then invited to send in their guesses of the identities of the interviewees, and if they guessed correctly, they would win small symbolic prizes. In its first year, the program generated 350,000 letters sent to the radio and television building on the Nile at Maspero, creating a minor crisis in the postal system. After that, Fahmy adjusted the format by having the riddle composed as a zegel, an old colloquial poetic form associated specifically with Egypt. The poet Bayram Atunsi was known as a master of the zegel, and so he became the first reciter of Ramadan riddles in Fahmy's show after the first year. When Bayram died in 1960, the job was given to Salah Jahin, another famous colloquial poet and an icon of the Nasser era. And subsequently, Fawzir Ramadan migrated to television and became a huge annual event. The videos that are playing silently are from the 1985 and 1986 editions of the show, which were respectively Amthal Sha'abiyya, folk proverbs, and Alf Layla wa Layla, tales from the Arabian Nights stories. As you can see, they were huge productions, always headlined by a star, often a female dancer and singer. In these shows, the riddle was first performed and then stated in poetic form at the end, as it was in the radio era with Bayram Atunsi and Salah Jahin. On the surface, the lavish and not very modest Egyptian productions couldn't look more different than Fawzi al-Khamis's quasi-austere Bedouin campfire set. But both programs take the same form, a riddle told each night, and the lucky person who guesses them all correctly wins a prize. In Egypt, the prizes became more than symbolic, though never as lucrative as the $8,100 prize that went to the winner of Sheikh Sultan's single question. You've seen how the amount of the prize was stated in Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams, and the explicit linking of the prize to dynastic and implicitly national patronage. By the time these programs you're looking at now were produced, Egyptian Fawzir Ramadan had been going for 30 years. Let me now show you how the prize was announced in the 1990 edition of Fawzir Ramadan, which was the year that I was doing my doctoral research. The theme in that year was World of Paper. The riddles were more or less about bureaucracy, passports, for example, or utility bills. It sounds like a rather odd theme, but certainly it's an interesting artifact for anybody who's interested in researching how the state was interpolated into the lives of Egyptians in the 1990s. My video clip shows just the introduction up to the point at which the prize is announced.
سيدتي وسادتي، فوازير رمضان بعنوان عالم ورق ورق ورق، وبتتناول 30 ورقة لها أهمية خاصة في حياتنا. الفوازير بطولة الفنانة الاستعراضية نيلي، وبيشترك معها في حلقة اليوم الفنان صبري عبد المنعم. الأشعار للشاعر عبد السلام أمين، لحن المقدمة والنهاية ولحن فزورة اليوم لعمار الشريعي، أما الاستعراضات فلحسن عفيفي، والإخراج جمال عبد الحميد.
اتحاد الإذاعة والتلفزيون القطاع الاقتصادي يقدم.
اسم المنتج نوريتاكي، نوع المنتج الصيني الرائع الجودة. اسم المنتج نوريتاكي، مكان البيع مركز فتيحي جدة. اسم المنتج نوريتاكي، نوع المنتج أطقم المائدة والشاي الرفيعة الذوق. اسم المنتج نوريتاكي، سمة المنتج الاهتمام بأدق التفاصيل. مركز فتيحي جدة يقدم 30,000 جنيه جوائز نقدية لفوازير رمضان. حظا سعيدا مع مركز فتيحي جدة.
مع تمنيات القطاع الاقتصادي
بحظ سعيد.
Obviously, the spectacularization of the event is in a different universe than Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams. But even a short glimpse at this introduction to that year's Fawazir Ramadan suggests a fusing of the state's legitimacy as the executor of nationalist expression with a religious ritual, but also a recasting of ritual into a secular holiday that punctuates the quotidian life of Egyptian citizens. The prize, 30,000 Egyptian pounds, was worth about $20,000 at the time, but that was for an entire month's worth of riddles, not the $8,100 for a single question that you saw in the Musabakat video. It's also worth noting that while the principle of politically instrumentalizing the prize is comparable in the two programs, the Egyptian Fawzir Ramadan's prize-giving patron isn't a political entity, but rather a company based in a Gulf state, the Fataihi Center in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. One might reasonably surmise an Egyptian state strategy of using sponsorship for Ramadan television programs to build alliances between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, or conversely, a Saudi effort to impose its growing oil-based political economic power on Egypt. Yet the Fataihi Center was a private business, and whether or not high-level politics were being played out through nationally branded acts of beneficence, there is no question that the Fataihi business empire had much to gain from such a prominent display. By the 1990s, at the dawn of the satellite broadcasting era in the Middle East, advertising rates for primetime television in Ramadan were skyrocketing, and there was no time more prime than the opening sequence of the Fawzir Ramadan. At that time, Egyptian television was still broadcast terrestrially, and most of the Arabic programming went onto a single government-owned and operated channel. During Ramadan, the post-iftar streets were nearly empty, only filling up with the usual traffic at the conclusion of the Fawzir. Hence, the awkward insertion of an advertisement into the otherwise ponderous opening of the 1990 edition of the program pointed to tensions between an increasingly beleaguered state-centric mode of Egyptian television production and the ever-expanding commercialism of the post-Nasser Infitah, an open door to a capitalist economy after decades of top-down state development. The Infitah was often resented and feared by the staff of public sector institutions. From the beginning of economic liberalization in the 1970s, the bulk of direct foreign investment brought to Egypt by economic liberalization came not from the West or Asia, but from the petro-wealth of Arab Gulf states. And so that awkward insertion of an advertisement for Noritaki China, marketed by the Fataihi Center in Jeddah, spoke volumes. Bundled with a lucrative prize offered by the company, it was jammed into a program obviously not designed with advertising intervals in mind. The main cost for the Fataihi company probably wasn't funding the prize. Rather, it was the advertising fee they had to pay to have the company's name brought to the attention of millions of rapt Egyptian television viewers for 30 nights. From the company perspective, it was an investment in social capital. The family business was founded by Sheikh Ahmed Hassan Hassan al-Fataihi, originally as a jewelry and gold store, and later branching into all sorts of luxury goods sold in multiple locations in Saudi Arabia and later internationally. Eventually, the company ventured into a wide variety of economic sectors unrelated to luxury goods, including healthcare, agriculture, industry, and public services. At this point, I want to stop to consider what media imply methodologically, particularly in terms of history and ultimately for memory. Digitization is a technological development, and technology is a material reality with consequences. Scholars of technology often talk about what they call affordances. The term refers to the potential of a technology in the context of goal-oriented behavior that turns to concrete actions. Affordances only exist in practice and in context. The concept helps to avoid extremes of either technological determinism on one hand, or on the other hand, radical social constructivism predicated on the assumption that discourses about technology are the only phenomena with any social or sociological relevance. In other words, there are always locally contingent interactions between affordances and the social context and actions of human beings. Scholars of information technology have their own set of affordances. persistence, visibility, spreadability, and searchability. Persistence is of obvious relevance to history and to memory. The idea is that everything that gets digitized and put onto a network tends to persist because everything passes through multiple servers which retain them. The scholarship tends to have in mind social media, Twitter, for instance. In theory, everything everyone says stays on the network forever. But affordances can't be discussed in isolation. An item on the internet, say a video of Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams, might be invisible to you and essentially resistant to any search you might do. That's why algorithms exist. If your internet search weren't limited by an algorithm based on your location, your language, and your internet search history, then every search you do would yield too many results to even display on your computer. In practice, persistence in networked communications is quite a quirky phenomenon. As a de facto archive, the internet is like quicksand compared to the paper records preserved in a conventional archive. In practical terms, as I'm sure you all know from experience, things come and go on the internet all the time. If I were writing a paper on Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams and Fawzir Ramadan based on printed press sources, I could be pretty confident that information recorded in 1990 or 1994 would still be exactly the same in 100 years, assuming that the library held a physical copy of the magazine, which, as you can imagine, is no longer something that you can take as a given. In reality, hard copies of mass circulation magazines as a source for a paper on these television shows would, I think, be inferior to the archive I actually used, namely my own personal recording of the programs augmented by YouTube and disparate websites. I was frankly surprised at how far I could get analyzing these programs using just the internet as an archive. I've had my recording of these programs for around 3 decades, but it had never occurred to me to try to find out information about Fawzi al-Khamis or on the Fatahi Center in Jeddah. Indeed, I suspect if I had tried to learn something about them on the internet in 1994, I wouldn't have found much of anything. Whereas in 2021, I readily found a television program on the career of Fawzi al-Khamis and a semi-professional video tribute to the family business empire of the Fatahis. The limits to these kinds of sources is also evident. Both video productions were hagiographic. It was easy to find the legendary versions of their lives. One would have to dig quite a bit more to deconstruct the legends if one were so inclined. And as for using the internet to reconstruct people's opinions about what they watched, one encounters equally thorny problems. For example, earlier I showed you a tweet about Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams. Here it is again. This might be a genuine expression of love for the ruler, or it could be an expression of what Egyptians call ta'arif, obsequious flattery, or you could gloss it as pimping oneself. But it could also have been produced by a bot, by a machine. I imagine big data specialists must have ways to disentangle bot posts on social media from posts by real people, but this sort of thing does throw open a whole new vista of analytical specialization. There are also huge limitations in trying to figure out more straightforward issues, such as what people actually saw on television when they were looking at the screen. One of the most useful digital items I possessed was the blatantly tacked-on advertisement for Noritaki China sold by the El Fatehi Center in the introduction to the 1990 Fawzir program. What one finds on the internet is quite a few digital copies of the credits in the introduction to Fawzir Ramadan programs, but never including the Radio and Television Union preface to the introduction. But it was precisely this very short segment of the original terrestrial broadcast that gave a hint of tension between the beleaguered public sector television production institution and the forces of economic liberalization, and also the Gulf state financing of Egypt's liberalization agenda. The larger problem is that when the internet stands in for an archive of television production, one doesn't get a sense of what you might call the connective tissue between the programs, the advertisements or the punctuation of the published television schedule with the ritual temporality of things like the call to prayer, which included introductory visualization of the azan, because television broadcasts didn't just interrupt the scheduled programming with sound, but also with imagery that revealed ideological agendas and political currents. The internet as archive, in fact, doesn't reveal very much about the sequence of materials in a television broadcast. You can get the skeleton of programming from published sources, newspapers and television guides, but those also don't give you a sense of the connective tissue between the items that were deemed important enough to put in the program. You can't get a sense of what someone sitting in the living room, stuffed with a massive iftar dinner, experienced in the lead up to an episode of Fawzir Ramadan. How can we contextualize such phenomena? As I understand this conference, its scope is what anthropologists refer to as expressive culture, which is creative expression in its social contexts. Expressive culture can be defined as the forms, processes, emotions, and ideas bound up in the social production of affecting presences, aesthetic forms and performances in everyday life, music, verbal art, play, material culture, celebration, ritual, and display. We presume that these cultural expressions can best be understood through their embeddedness in everyday life. Yet we can only know culture through mediation. The medium for most of the written records we currently study historically is paper, which is both durable and much harder to alter than digital media. Paper can burn or get wet, but otherwise it lasts a long time if it's put in archives or libraries or tucked under your grandfather's bed. Both my recording of Musabaqat fi Hayat al-Ams and my tape of the 1990 edition of Fawzir Ramadan had to be converted to digital media. But much of what we're counting as culture in this conference was born digital since the early 2000s. And I'm judging by the abstracts. Actually, now I'm judging from hearing the papers as well. Roughly half the papers presented at this conference focused substantially on born digital material. I'm not counting the keynotes. The papers conform to a familiar set of categories which tend to create a moving gap between the analysis of contemporary concerns by disciplines such as anthropology, political science, sociology, and various forms of literary and media studies, and on the other hand, a focus on any kind of history. This unacknowledged temporal and disciplinary gap between the present and the world of 50 or more years ago is particularly pronounced in Euro-American Middle Eastern studies, for reasons I won't get into. The bottom line is that there's an informal convention that something becomes historic when about 50 years have elapsed. So by this convention, at present, history begins in the 1970s and goes back from there. In this conference, 4 papers are clearly historical. Others may have a historical angle, but I'm guessing that they're more focused on the present than the past. Of the 4 most obviously historical papers, one of them breaks the 50-year rule. That was the paper on the history of Rotana. For the record, I judged 4 papers as probably mixed between ethnography, or at least human sources, interviews or oral history, and digital or digitized sources, and 9 as primarily ethnographic. And of course, any of the papers might go, and some of them have gone, in directions I couldn't predict from just reading the abstracts. We can think about the papers in terms of sources. First, papers about the past that rely on paper documents, which may have been digitized but were not born digital. Second, papers about the present based on mixed sources, focusing primarily on the analysis of objects, and ranging from written or audiovisual texts to artistic works, but objects understood through engagement with live human sources. And third, papers about the present based primarily on social practices, though with a material dimension, such as in the several papers that look at sartorial culture. This scheme more or less maps onto chronology from the most historical and least accessible to live human sources at one end of the spectrum to the most sociological and least dependent on the analysis of objects at the other. Moreover, the closer you get to the present, the more you're analyzing cultural expressions, that are born digital and lives that are increasingly lived through digital media. Think about this in the context of the small case study that I presented to you. I had an artifact that happened to be in my possession, an analog recording of a television show which I digitized. When I first began thinking about this paper, I thought I would use that in my introduction. I'd say everything I wanted to say about it in a couple of pages based mainly on the thing itself. It didn't work out quite that way, and the reason is that the sources I had to contextualize it turned out in some ways to be quite interesting and productive. In some ways, this was the case, yet Ramadan television programs of the sort I've been describing here may or may not exist in archives. So how will we be able to write about such phenomena in the future? Egypt has a radio and television archive which holds content created and broadcast by the state, which in theory accounts for all production in the era of terrestrial broadcasting. In other words, until sometime in the 1990s, when content production began to be subcontracted to private companies concurrent with a shift to digital production. But national archives curate history, preserving what the state considers to be important. The Fawzia Ramadan extravaganzas of the 1980s were directly produced by the Egyptian Radio and Television Union, which may have archived them, though it appears that at least some shows were sold to Rotana, a Saudi company, at least if we believe the company's own claims. But the programs alone don't necessarily convey even the bare bones of the experience of television. I have no idea what the situation is with Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams, nor do I know anything about the role of the state in Gulf media production. But I do know that since the 2000s, throughout the Middle East, most media production has been done by private companies. States don't have a clear stake in archiving such material. The production companies may have the right to preserve the material, but not necessarily an interest. What I'm driving at is that audiovisual content, particularly born digital content, is quite precarious. Some sources have straightforward owners. Consider photographs, an analog medium, for instance. Most photographs clearly belonged to individuals at one time, though they may eventually become alienated from them and end up on the market, being sold in antique stores, or occasionally end up in archives. By contrast, a massive amount of digital media content is ownerless in practical, if not necessarily in legal terms. Rotana may own Fawzia Ramadan, if that advertisement is to be believed, but YouTube is awash with bootleg copies that were recorded off of TV broadcasts. The relevant archive and the repository of much of the available content of the Ramadan programs I've been talking about is digital. YouTube is a de facto archive, and so is a great deal of other digital content available to a researcher, but on a highly differential basis. Some is accessible now in the shifting sands of social media. Some is accessible as long as someone is willing to pay to keep it on a publicly accessible server. Some of it is less accessible in some locations than in others, depending on state policies towards private ownership and political sensitivities. Material may exist in places I can't easily find, or that I'm restricted from seeing for various reasons, or because the ocean of networked digital content is so vast that I can't search it. The two Ramadan programs I've been talking about were made respectively 27 and 31 years ago, just before the wave of digitization that constitutes the grounding of many of the papers presented in this conference. There are plenty of ways to research such programs. One can approach the programs as many of you have, by writing hybrid papers based on texts or objects combined with interviews and ethnography. One could do this with Musabakat fi Hayat al-Ams, or with the Fawzia Ramadan. Someone who watched them on magical Ramadan nights at the age of 10 would still be barely middle-aged. You could talk to them. Secondary performers in the programs, or the lower level technical personnel, would be just a little bit older. But the most meaningful production personnel are in their 60s or older. Nelly, the star of the 1990 edition of Fawzia Ramadan, which was sponsored by the Fatehi Center, is 71. Abdus Salam Amin, the poet who put that season's riddles into verse, is deceased. So is Hassan Afifi, the choreographer and a key creative force in films and television programs from the 1960s through the 1990s. On the Emirati side, Fawzi al-Khamis, the presenter and probably the creative force behind the program, is deceased. Salim Saeed Nahi Niadi, the old man who won the shooting contest, was 56 in 1994, or 55, he wasn't sure. He would now be 83 or maybe 82. The man identified by Fawzi al-Khamis as Sheikh Sultan bin Khalifa bin Sultan al Nahyan, who set the riddle from his car, presumably is still with us. The point is that the window for researching television shows from the early to mid-1990s through human sources is closing. In another decade, there will be little to gain from talking to people who were there at the time. In 2 decades, enough time will have passed that everyone associated with the productions will have died. It is at that point, when the human sources are gone, that historians will start to take an interest in the 1990s. It will be history. Imagine a historical research project carried out sometime in the future on the culture and politics of Islamic rituals in the 1990s and their associated national holidays, say in 100 years, as the title of my paper suggests. What will the sources be? Whether they're written, photographic, audiovisual, or hybrid forms combining media that were once considered discrete, they will be overwhelmingly digital. The transformation to digital storage of information took place over decades from roughly the mid-20th century, but of course at different rates depending on local contingencies. Globally, around half the world's technological capacity to store, communicate, and compute information was digital by the early 2000s. If you plot the growth of digital technology against the increase in population of Gulf states, you get a sense of the fundamental digitalness of this conference's subject matter. The population of the United Arab Emirates was 92,000 in 1960. It's now almost 10 million, 6 million of whom were added after the year 2000, which was roughly the global tipping point between analog and digital information storage. The United Arab Emirates, and to varying extents, the entire Gulf, was born with born digital medium. Consider the full title of this conference, Culture Made in Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula as a new major player on the Arab cultural scene. The center of gravity in this conference is the 2000s. The historical papers tend to look back to about the beginnings of this transformation from an analog to a digital world. The practical reality of digital culture is undoubtedly familiar to you all, given that half the papers engage with digital sources directly, and surely the more exclusively ethnographic papers still must deal with the fact that their interlocutors live lives in which separations we once tended to make between cyberspace and real life are no longer useful. Distinctions between a digital sphere and an actual sphere are, of course, crucially important, but both are equally real. Moreover, social phenomena accessible through participant observation and interviews will leave few traces that can be analyzed by scholars in the future, except by a digital medium. The networked communication technology that is both the vehicle for cultural expression and the predominant means of recording its existence is both corrosive to memory and also an ocean of information that can be mined to the extent that it remains visible and searchable. If we take seriously the conference's emphasis on the Arabian Peninsula as a major new player on the Arab and global scene, then we must consider the unique configuration of both ephemerality and persistence that carries either the culture we're analyzing now or will bear whatever traces of it are carried into the future. The digital age is global, but there are few societies that can themselves be seen as born digital along with the media on which their existence is expressed and recorded. The Arab states of the Gulf surely play a major role in a brave new world of cultural production. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Armbrust, for your thrilling keynote. So maybe I could raise a first question because you are right. Most of
hold on a second. I'm trying to stop the share here, or maybe somebody else can do it for me.
Okay, yeah, it's fine now. Yeah, so you are right. Most of culture made in Arabia and beyond actually today will be preserved on digital media, and not only culture actually, because you know, for instance, Abu Dhabi government aspires, for instance, to digitize all the data produced by the public entities by the end of this decade in order to have a full paperless administration. So it means that actually doing history now implied, you know, to take into consideration different kind of sources, and to think about another way to do history, and to collect, to select the different information. And actually, all the questions pertaining to archives preservation that you raised in your communication are a key question for our today's societies. And I would like to raise a question, but actually this is your question that you raised in your paper, in your presentation. Will private companies or governments put an end to the jumble of sounds, image, and text that we have currently at our fingertips?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. But I think one answer is that there's a patchwork of regulation, and you know, there isn't one set of regulations that pertains to digital contents throughout the entire world. The United States may have different rules than Europe has, and Europe may have different rules than states in the Gulf have. And so will private companies or states own the material? You know, I think that the answer to that question will be variable depending on which society you're looking at. And of course, we can't really predict the future. I mean, we're accustomed to thinking of the internet as being essentially free. You know, it was first known to us as the World Wide Web. And, you know, for it to be a real World Wide Web, it had to be global and it had to be free. And there are already forces in the United States that are trying to rein that in and to essentially restrict information only to paying customers. And similar initiatives could, you know, could change this. It could basically, if I try to do this paper in 10 years, I might find more stuff, or I might find nothing. You know, it all depends on what happens to the, you know, the regulation and the ownership of the internet. But I don't think I'm going to find very much of this material in, you know, sort of organized state-funded archives. And in fact, the history of people trying to create digital archives is pretty fraught, to the best of my knowledge. I mean, I was in Egypt in 2011 during the January 25th revolution, and there were immediately a number of initiatives begun to try and archive the revolution, because that revolution, as of course famously, a lot of it was born digital. A lot of the discussion of what was happening on the ground took place by digital means. And a lot of the stuff that didn't take place by digital means was digitized. And so there was an immediate concern with trying to remember what happened, but it proved to be, as you can imagine, massively contentious. Who was going to, you know, determine the principles by which you curate the archive, and who was going to pay to store the archive? Almost every single one of these digital initiatives to archive the revolution failed. In a few cases, they had to smuggle the archives that they had out of the country on unnetworked hard drives. And I don't know what's happened to them since then. I think I know somebody who probably does know, but whether those will ever become accessible, or whether they'll end up in an archive that can properly preserve them, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, so there are no efficient regulations. So,
well, and you know, until we have a global government, no. I mean, you know, who's going to, you know, force, the United Arab Emirates to have the same policy as the United States.
That's true. So thank you very much. Maybe I give the floor to the attendees. Yes, Frédéric.
Hi, good evening, Walter. Thank you for this great talk. I had a question concerning what do you think is the Gulf's role in what I would call the privatization of Arab nostalgia? The fact that, for instance, if you want to watch a concert of Kulthum or Faiza Ahmed or Nagat or Sabah Fakhri for Syria or Sabah and Fayrouz, obviously you are going to be watching Rotana Zaman. For the Gulf cultural productions, well, since you were mentioning, you were using a UAE document as an example, well, you do have a channel in the UAE, which is Dubai Zaman, that's accessible on the net, but it seems to be a private channel. So there's, we are in a region where people have the same nostalgia that you would find in Europe or in China or in the United States for cultural productions, audiovisual productions of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, etc. But whereas in France, the website you would go to in order to find some old television of the 1960s and 70s would be INA, Institut National de l'Audiovisuel. Here, in the Arab region, you would actually direct yourself, you would go towards private actors and actually Gulf private actors for the whole region to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I'm sure you know, the bulk of the Egyptian film library, you know, the actual celluloid. People still, I mean, I noticed that some of the abstracts are still referring to cinema as celluloid, even though cinema is now actually as digital as music and television. But the old Egyptian film archive, which was held by the state, was sold to, you know, a lot of it was sold to Rotana, and some of it was sold to ART. And so Egypt no longer retains the, you know, the possession of those old films, although they may still possess copies. And so part of the situation that you're referring to is that ownership of the copy often ends up being tantamount to ownership of the thing itself. And of course, with digitization, you can make perfect copies of things endlessly. And so you do in fact get a situation where Rotana has bought up all of the Egyptian cultural heritage and cinema, and I guess also in TV too, if that advertisement for the Fawzir Ramadan by Rotana is to be believed. But you also, at present, have this massively unwieldy, well, it's sort of chaotic. It's like the wild, wild west. I mean, if you go onto YouTube and search almost anything, you'll find people have uploaded it, people have recorded it off TV, and of course the quality of the copies people are making off TV now are good. And so, you know, if I want to find an old Egyptian film, I can almost always find it on YouTube. It may, in fact, be legally owned by Rotana at this point, and the Egyptian government may have maintained, you know, copies of the film, even though they sold the negatives to Rotana. And so, you know, the ownership of these objects is being held by more and more restrictive, privatized forces. At the same time, it's just exploding and proliferating everywhere. And you find the same thing with photographs. I mean, you find many social media groups that specialize in the circulation of nostalgic photographs. And sometimes these are photographs that people own themselves as their personal photographs. But if they obtain digital copies of photographs from other people, then they consider them to be their own possessions. And I've heard of cases where people actually try to monetize them. They say, I have a massive collection of photographs, which you can use for research. how much we pay them. And then, when you investigate further, you find that actually it's a massive collection of photographs that has been harvested in digital form from the internet. And so, I think that the legal privatization of these kinds of heritage objects is going to continue, but I don't know whether it's going to matter, because when digital copies get out into the public sphere, they basically become the ownership of everybody, the possessions of everybody.
There is an interesting remark by Pierre France about Rotana, so I'm going to read it. I don't know if you can read what he wrote in the conversation window. It says, apparently Rotana did digitalize tapes in the early 2000s, but the scope of the archival process is unknown, of course. Whether the hard drives are still somewhere, have been put on a server since then, or are and will be available is, of course, another question. The fact that many actors, TV channels, including Rotana, choose sometimes for their nostalgic programs privately uploaded YouTube videos rather than searching their own archives is super interesting in this regard. To super interesting, we could add extremely concerning, and maybe would send some chills at the same time.
Well, I have to say that the Rotana paper was super interesting to me as well. And I mean, particularly the discussion in that paper of the inaccessibility of Rotana. They don't respond to you. They don't throw open whatever they have to you. They're trying to monetize it to some extent, but if you're a small person, a researcher, for example, then you're not a big enough player for them to get money from you. So they just don't respond, which is actually very similar to the radio and TV archive in Egypt, which is owned by the state. It's also one of the least responsive, most difficult archives to work in. I had a student, a doctoral student a few years ago, who wanted to do some research there. She was doing research on Abdelhalim Mahmoud, who was a rector of Al-Azhar, and he was one of the people who made a very popular religious broadcast program in the 1960s, and so she wanted to hear some of his old tapes. And so they let her into the archive eventually after months of trying, and they let her listen to the tape in a booth. It was on an audio cassette. It hadn't been digitized. They wouldn't allow her to take notes. And so she basically could sort of sit there and listen to Abdelhalim Mahmoud's, sermons or other religious programs that he did, and take notes. But that was it. That was all you're going to get from them. And that was after months of trying, and it was only a tiny proportion of the holdings that the radio and TV archive had. So we seem to be in a world where neither states nor private business interests are going to help us with this.
Any other questions?
Are there more questions?
You have in the Q and R. Yes, there is a question in Q and R, Jan.
Okay.
Let's see. Yeah, Egyptian Fawazir were actually broadcast all over the Arab world. Advertisements on those shows were not targeting an Egyptian audience exclusively. Are these Egyptian productions pan-Arab versus the UAE-focused show Sabukat? Well, the tape that I had actually was not pan-Arab. It was a terrestrial broadcast. That was from 1990. That was really the 1990 wasn't really yet the satellite age for Egypt. The broadcasting was there were very few people who had satellite dishes at that time, and there wasn't very much satellite broadcasting. But if you're talking about later, although the Fawazir, as far as I know, in Egypt, the whole Fawazir custom has died down in the satellite age. They may still be making them, I don't know. But they're not the big deal that they used to be. And part of the problem is the huge proliferation of satellite channels that are broadcasting Musalsalat and other Ramadan entertainment fare. And so the last few years that I've been in Egypt, nobody was really, during Ramadan, nobody was paying very much attention to Fawazir anymore. There were lots of other programs they were watching, and Salsalat and other kinds of game shows and reality shows and so forth. But you know, the world in which you could get the whole nation watching one thing was gone, because you could get 500 free-to-air channels on your satellite dish now. So you know, you couldn't get everybody watching the same thing anymore. But it is true that when one of the problems with advertising and sort of pan-era broadcasting is that you can't target an audience very well. I mean, this phenomenon has been observed by many people. You can only advertise, you know, sort of the things that can be sold throughout the entire region, rather than specifically targeted to national audiences. And there's a question, how about TV stations such as Dubai and Abu Dhabi? Dubai TV had 2 production companies that no longer exist. Are there archives available? I don't know. I wish I knew. You know, I don't know what the state of television archives is in the Gulf, or really very much about what it is like in Egypt. I mean, I do know that in Egypt, a lot of archival material ends up leaking out of the archives and being sold. And this happens also to the paper archive. It happens to the Alexandria Library. It basically happens to all state institutions, which is why many people don't trust state institutions. And as far as I know, there is no national archive for collecting personal papers in Egypt, and possibly not anywhere in the Arab Middle East. But if there were, I suspect most people wouldn't trust depositing their papers in it, because they'd be afraid that they would disappear, they would be monetized. Are there more questions? I'm not seeing more questions.
Yeah, I do not believe that there are more questions.
I'm not seeing.
Laure is asking a question. Yeah.
I can ask a question actually. So I think the question of the digitization of archives is interesting, because digital media are often seen as sort of future oriented, but they are very much looking towards the past, right? And I mean, there could be an argument that the internet is in itself nothing but an archive, in the sense that everything that is produced there is immediately, in theory at least, preserved. Although there are some social media now that are precisely sort of producing content that is meant to be temporary and to disappear, but that's another story. But so I was wondering about precisely the archival status of the kind of shows that you were looking at in the presentation, in the sense that it seems to me that they are precisely posted on YouTube by people, not so much with the goal of sort of simply preserving or creating an archive of this, but precisely with the purpose of sort of addressing a specific audience, right? Which is this imagine nostalgic community of people who have watched this show, and maybe their children, or maybe people who will look at it as a document from the past. And so I think another, sorry, it's not a very coherent question, but I think another essential dimension of digital archives is that, at least the ones that are posted on social media, is that they're by definition interactive. And so I was thinking about, you know, what you were saying about potential ethnographic interviews, how to go back to the context in which these shows were watched, etc. But I think that's actually something that you find a lot in the YouTube comments, for example, under these videos, where people precisely go and watch them to recall these moments, and then post about it and have entire discussions about it in these comments. So I was wondering how, as a historian, you would maybe consider this as
well, you know, I'm not a historian, I'm an anthropologist, but comments can be edited most of the time. And so, you know, if you're looking at them, you know, a week after they were made, they tell you one thing. If you're looking at them 10 years later, I'm not sure what you would find. And this is the case with all social media. People go back and edit their comments. You know, I remember, you know, again, in 2011, trying to go back to the very beginning of the Kulina Khalid Said Facebook group. and try and, see what people were saying back at the very beginning. And people had changed things. They had changed, for example, the images that they put next to their faces, which were symbolic and, carried meaning. So you were no longer getting exactly the same meaning that you might have gotten if you had looked at it at the time that it was first put on there. And sometimes people, they may want to protect themselves. And so they remove stuff that they said that might be incriminating. It may still exist on a server somewhere, but the state probably won't be able to find it. And so, you can't necessarily be completely confident that if you can get a hold of these comments, that you will be able to do anything with them. I mean, Twitter comments, I think Twitter is now monetizing doing research on old Twitter, because Twitter doesn't last very long, and I think they're starting to make tweets available to researchers, but for a fee. But even then, I'm not so sure how much I would trust them. Things disappear really fast sometimes on the internet, and sometimes they're there forever. I mean, this idea of persistence is like Saussurean linguistics, looking at language as a system. And it's this beautiful thing, all the parts fit together and you can figure out exactly how it works. But, language in practice as opposed to language as a system are two completely different things. I mean, you might not be able to do what you can do with language as a system in an actual social context. Language as a system, and this is what persistence is. It's like, yeah, in theory, everything's there, but only if it's searchable, and only if it's discoverable, and only if I can find it. And you won't necessarily be able to find it. And of course, the internet is just expanding and getting bigger all the time. That's, like I said in the lecture, that's why they have algorithms, because without the algorithm, you couldn't search all of it even now, let alone 100 years from now. Well, of course, I mean, there may be a technological solution to all this. Maybe the search tools will become vastly better than they are now, and we'll be able to extract all kinds of information that we can't get now, or maybe not. I wouldn't know what to predict any better than you do.
Okay, thank you very much for your replies, and especially for your communication tonight. And now I would like just to give the floor for a while to Frederick, because I think he has to announce something for tomorrow morning.
I was just reminding panelists that we will be starting our third and final day of this conference tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. with a panel entitled Filming the Gulf, Images and Audiences. So we will meet tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Abu Dhabi time. And thank you, Walter, for this fantastic, thought-provoking conference you just gave us, and lecture. I mean, the conference, that would be the French.
That's what you produced this fantastic conference, and it is. I'm loving the conference. It's a great. I haven't said very much. I haven't said anything until my presentation. I'm lurking, but I'm learning a lot, and I think the papers are fabulous.
Thank you very much. So we'll convene again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Goodbye.